In this section, we are going to be talking about an important person in the production process, an important person in the rehearsal room, the playwright, and a book called The Poetics, which will be an important basis for a lot of things that we're going to be doing in this course going forward. So we're going to be talking about the playwright, and of course, with all of these lectures, you'll find I like to start with the most basic and obvious question, which is, what is the playwright? Who is the playwright? What do they do? And luckily enough for this section, it's very self-explanatory. The playwright is very obviously the person who writes the play. And so we're going to go into how a playwright actually goes about doing that. But first, before we do that, we should go back and quickly see where it all began. So, in this section, like many others you'll find throughout the semester, we are going to be going all the way back to ancient Greece. So we go all the way back to ancient Greece, and it's mainly because of the poetics that we start here. As I mentioned in the course introduction, theater itself begins well before ancient Greece with religious rituals. However, we don't really have a definition of playwriting and of what theater is until ancient Greece because of the book we're going to be talking about called The Poetics. So we go back to ancient Greece and we'll take a moment here to figure out how theater was actually organized in Greece. So in Greece, there you would write a trilogy of what they would call dramas and one satyr play, which is basically a satirical play, and you would put them in a festival. It was called the yearly Dionysian Festival, and just like festivals now, at the end of the year, somebody would be crowned the winner of the festival. Now, this festival was done in honor of the god Dionysus. As you can see in his picture on the left there, well, a statue of him on the left there, and in the bottom right, kind of a drawing of what theater probably looked like back in ancient Greece. So theater was done in honor of this god, and he was a very interesting god to, I guess, commemorate theater too, because he was basically the fun god. He was the god of wine and sex. So he was the god of pleasure, basically. And so they did theater in honor of him. Now, it wasn't figurative what they were doing. It really was considered a religious ceremony or experience. If you look in that bottom right corner, you'll notice in the center of the theater, there's an object in the center of the stage, which was an actual altar that was placed there in honor of the god Dionysus. It was an altar to him, and people took it very seriously. There's a funny story about the Greek playwright Euripides, who was kind of a rebel rouser in his time. He wrote plays that, for the most part, pretty much pissed everybody off. He wrote plays that basically questioned the authority of the aristocracy and the government. And there was a story where during one of his performances, the audience was getting so upset that he feared he wasn't going to make it out of the theater alive. And so what he did was he ran onto the stage and he wrapped himself around the altar, that object in the center of the stage in that picture, and he stayed there. And because he knew that it was considered a sin to kill somebody on the altar. And so the way the story goes is he just wrapped himself around that and stayed there until everyone calmed down and left. And then when everyone left, I'm sure he booked it out of there as fast as he could. And so it's kind of a funny story, but it does give you an idea of the people of ancient Greece and what their thinking was in terms of these shows. So it was an actual religious experience in honor of this god Dionysus. So a playwright would write a trilogy of dramas, like I said, and they would write one satyr play, the satirical play, And before we go forward, it is worth noting the definition of this word drama. You'll hear me refer to it a couple times throughout this semester, and it has a kind of a different meaning than what we think of it today. If I were to ask you right now, what is a drama? The answer I get most of the time is something along the lines of a serious story, or a story that makes you cry, or anything with serious subject matter. And that's absolutely true for our modern definition of it. But the classical definition of the word comes back from ancient Greece, and it basically just referred to a story written for the purpose of being performed. And that was very simply what a drama was: a story written for the purpose of being performed, as opposed to, say, like an epic poem, or a novel or something like that. A novel is written for the purpose of you to sit down and read it. And a play, though we do read plays, they aren't really written for that purpose. They're written for the purpose of watching them performed on stage. So in many ways, the classical Greek definition of drama is basically just what we think of today as the word play. So a drama was a story written for the purpose of being performed, and there were two types of dramas. There was comedy and there was tragedy. And these words have kind of a different meaning as well. So for instance, the genre of comedy. If I were to ask you, well, what is a comedy? The common answer today would be, well, a story that's funny. Any type of story that makes you laugh. And though that is true for our modern definition of it, it's different for the classical definition of a comedy. A comedy was a story where the main character achieves their goal. So whatever the main character's goal was at the beginning of the story, if they achieved that goal, then the story was considered a comedy. And then on the flip side of that, a tragedy was a story where the main character failed their goal. And so the two definitions, or the two genres of drama, really go back to the objective of the main character. If you ever seen that classical image of theater, the image that pops up at the bottom center there of the two masks, one frowning, one smiling, that's where it comes from. It's the image of drama, and it depicts the two types of drama: comedy and tragedy. So you can have a story where the story is incredibly sad. You don't have a laugh through the entire story. But if the main character achieves whatever it was they set out for at the beginning, then classically speaking, it would be a comedy. And on the flip side of that, you can have a story that's hilarious, that's really funny. But whatever that main character wanted to do, they failed at it, then classically speaking, that would be a tragedy. If you ever look at a list of Shakespeare's plays, they're very clearly delineated which ones are the comedies and which ones are the tragedies. And they kind of say, especially with Shakespeare's work, the comedies end in marriage and the tragedies end in death. That's usually the best way to figure them out. But again, it's not, classically speaking, not every story not every comedy is funny, not every tragedy is sad. For instance, Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice is an incredibly sad story. It's, if you've never read it, it's a good read, or a good watch if you can find a performance of it. But this is the story that deals with the character Shylock, who's supposed to be the antagonist of the story. He's a Jewish character, and the two main characters are these two Italian men. And at the beginning of the story, they need to borrow money from Shylock, and one of them also falls in love with his daughter. And so, the story happens, and in the end, Shylock and the two men go to trial for Shylock to get his money back from them. And basically, what happens in the end is Shylock's daughter abandons him, and he's stripped of his religion and forced to give up Judaism, and forced to convert to Christianity. And this play has one of Shakespeare's most powerful monologues, where late in the play, Shylock says, the monologue, if you cut me, do I not bleed? And so he basically, what he says in this monologue is, I feel happiness just like you do. I feel sadness just like you do. I feel joy like you do. I feel pain like you do. If you cut me, I bleed just like you, and yet you treat me differently. Why is that? So it's an incredibly powerful, very heartbreaking monologue. But in the end, our main characters are those two Italian guys. They win their case in the end. He wins the heart of Shylock's daughter, and they get married, and it's considered, classically speaking, a comedy, even though it's anything but. Now, that's not to say everyone, should, after watching this, should, go about their life, and the next time their friend says something like, "Oh, there's this really funny comedy playing," and you go to them, "Well, that's not really what that definition means." The meanings of words change, and so we need to embrace them. But it is good to know where they came from. Um, and you will, at this point in my life, I kind of use the term drama interchangeably to mean either a story of serious subject matter or very simply just a play. And this is where that comes from. So the thing we're going to be discussing for the rest of this class is a book called The Poetics. The Poetics was one of the first, um, I guess, literary critiques or definitions of what makes a good drama. It was written by Aristotle around 335 BC. And Aristotle, sat down and was a big fan of the theater and saw what everybody was doing and realized there needs to be something out there that actually defines what this is. And not only defines what it is, but then also defines or gives guidance as to how to make, how to create a well-made drama. And so he sat down and wrote the Poetics, and the way the Poetics is structured is it basically lists 6 elements in order of importance, and these are the 6 elements that every well-written drama needs. And the 6 elements that every drama needs, and then he explains how to do them well. The Poetics is still a book that we use today, still widely used today. In fact, it's used quite heavily in the world of screenwriting. Um, they say that every successful screenwriter has a copy of the Poetics on their desk. And that's mainly due to the fact that because the Poetics was one of the first guides to creating literature, it's become, and because it was so ingrained in how we've learned how to tell stories, it has become a little formulaic. And in the world of screenwriting, formula works very well. And so screenwriters will use it as a guide much more than maybe people do in theater now. And along those same lines, you're going to find as we go through this that there are some rules that you might say, well, that's not necessarily true because this such and such story goes against that, and this other story goes against that. And it's true that some of these rules might, seem like we don't follow them as much now, but that's only because people created those stories consciously going against what the Poetics has taught. We wouldn't have really gotten those stories that go against the Poetics unless we had the Poetics for people to think, well, this is what I'm revolting against. And there are many points in here where we've kind of strayed from Aristotle's rules, and yet we've still stayed exactly the same. So we're going to go through, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to go through Aristotle's 6 elements. So we're going to start right at the beginning here with number 1. And so if you want to take a moment to see if you can just guess on your own, what would be the number 1 most important element of every story? The number 1 most important thing that every story needs. And the one that Aristotle defines, the most basic element, or the most important, not basic, the most important element of every story is the plot. Number 1 most important element of every story is the plot. So he goes on to define what is a plot and what makes a well-written plot. Well, what he says, what defines a plot, is very simply the arrangement of the incidents, the arrangement of the events of the story. Um, he says not the story itself, but the way that the incidents are presented. You could also hear this referred to as the structure of a story. If, people will talk about it's a well-crafted structure, or they're not sure of what the structure of the story is. He's basically saying the way that you arrange the events of your story, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, that's what a plot is. But now he goes on to talk about, well, what makes a well-written plot? What makes a good plot? So the first thing he gives us is that it must have a beginning, middle, and end. Of course, this might seem pretty basic to most of you. Every story must have a beginning, middle, and end. But I can tell you, as a playwright myself, as a writer myself, it's much easier said than done. The beginning is always easy to come up with. That's basically the premise of your story, the idea you have. The end is always easy to come up with because you have the big thing that you want to get to, and the middle is usually the most difficult. What happens in the very middle of the story? This is again another example of why this is used so much in screenwriting. This is basically the idea of a three-act story structure. If you ever take a class in screenwriting, you'll learn that every movie you watch is separated into three acts. And very few of them maybe will have five acts. But the vast, vast majority of movies you watch are separated into three acts. But you don't really know in the film when that happens because um, they don't dictate when an act begins and ends, unlike theater where there's usually an intermission, so you'll know. Uh, but in film, if you ever take a class in film or in screenwriting and you learn the basic act structure, you'll never be able to watch a movie again without pointing out to your friend next to you, oh, there's the end of Act One, and then your friend getting mad and never wanting to watch a movie with you ever again. But this is the basic film three-act structure. Everything must have a beginning, middle, and end. The next thing he tells us is that the plot must follow the rules of cause and effect. So what he's saying here is that something happens at the beginning of the story, which causes the next thing to happen, which causes the next thing to happen, and so on and so forth until you get to something that happens that doesn't cause anything else to happen, and that's the end of your story. What he's saying here is that you should be able to take any random moment in the story and take that moment out of the story. Now that you've taken that moment out, if the story still makes just as much sense as it did before, the story can happen in exactly the same way, it doesn't feel like anything is missing, well, then that thing that you took out is not needed in the story. It is not part of the cause and effect chain. However, if you take any random moment in the story out and suddenly the story seems disjointed, something isn't connecting, something doesn't make sense, it feels like something is missing, well, then that moment is needed because it is part of the cause and effect chain. Something feels like it's missing because there was a cause and no effect. So he says that you must follow the rules of cause and effect. The next thing he tells us is the story must be of serious magnitude. And this is one of those first instances where we strayed away from Aristotle's rules, and yet we've still stayed pretty much true to it. So what he means here by the story must be of serious magnitude is, well, in his time, what he actually meant when he wrote this is that the story must be about important people. There was this cultural belief in ancient Greece that the higher you rise, the farther you fall. And that's why all of the Greek plays, the characters are usually the king or the queen or prince or their daughter, or they're about the ruling class or the aristocracy. And most Greek tragedies will end with somebody in the ruling class or the aristocracy falling on bad times. And then the chorus, who represents the common people, will come out in the end and say something along the lines of, man, thank God we're down here at the bottom of society, because if we were at the top, we would have so much farther to fall. Thank God we're down here at the bottom. And I think nowadays we look at that and we kind of think, well, that's ridiculous. Obviously that's not true. Usually the best stories today are about people who are at the bottom of whatever social ladder we're looking at, who want to rise up. So that was more of what Aristotle's original intention was, but the rule is still true, that the story must be of serious magnitude, because basically what he was saying here is that the conflict or the problem in the story must be the most important thing in the life of the character. The problem must be the most important thing in the life of the character. And think about it. If you go to watch a movie and the characters come out and they say, I need to win this contest to win all this money. It's okay if I don't win it, it doesn't really matter. I'll still be alive. I still have a comfortable life, but it would be nice if I win it, but I don't really need to win it. Well, you're going to be sitting there saying, this is ridiculous. I just wasted, $20 and 2 hours of my time to watch something that doesn't matter. So, however, on the flip side of that, you can take any conflict, anything at all, something that most people or even yourself might seemingly think is frivolous and unimportant, and if you make it the most important thing in the life of that character, suddenly your audience will care about it. For example, you could have a story where the main character wants to win like a national video game championship. They want to be the national, I don't know, Madden champion. And you're sitting there going, I couldn't care less about video games. This is stupid. But as you watch the story, you realize that this main character's whole identity is tied up in being the best at this thing. The character has nothing else in their life. Their whole identity is about being the best. And now there's a competition to name who is the best. And if he doesn't win this, he will have no sense of self, no sense of identity. I'll be lost in my life. What else do I have but knowing that I am the best at this one thing? And you'll find that halfway through the story, you'll suddenly be thinking, oh my God, I hope he wins the video game championship. And so, because it's so important to the main character, the audience in turn, will care about it. So the story must be of serious magnitude to the main character. The last element he tells us about plot is that the plot must be complex. Now, what he means by this is, not that every story needs to be as complicated as the movie Inception, but basically that you need to have multiple obstacles in the way of your main characters. So remember, he says that every story must have a beginning, middle, and end. But that doesn't mean that there's one thing that happens at the beginning, one thing to happen in the middle, and one thing that happens at the end, and that's the end of your story. There needs to be multiple complications in the way of your main character. Um, and so that's what makes a complex plot. Again, if you were to take a screenwriting course, they take this very same rule and just explain it a little differently, where they say, every movie you've ever watched follows this basic structure. Beginning, you run your character up a tree. Middle, you throw rocks at the main character. And ending, you bring your character down from the tree. They either fall out or they climb down. And that is basically every movie you've ever watched. And that's just another way of saying that the plot must be complex. You need to throw rocks at your main character. You need to throw multiple obstacles at the character for them to overcome. And so this is the basic elements that he gives us about plot. So we're going to move on to the second one. So we know that number one is plot. So the number one most important element of every story is the plot. And so now we move on to the second most important element of every story. So if you want to take a second, see if you can guess what it is. Some of you might have guessed setting, which is on the list, but not at this point yet. But number two is actually character. Second most important element of every story, according to Aristotle, are the characters. And so let's look at what goes into making a character. We have on the bottom here a picture of blinded Oedipus being led by his daughter Antigone, probably the most famous character from ancient Greece to guide us through learning about characters. So the first thing he tells us, the fact that character is number two on the list tells us that the characters are a function of the plot. The characters are a function of the plot. So what that means is the characters are there to serve the plot. You don't have the plot, you don't create a plot to serve the characters. It's the other way around. And basically what that means is you could have the most interesting character ever created, but if you don't have an interesting plot for them to live out, then the audience won't care. For example, you take the movie Forrest Gump, Forrest Gump is probably a very interesting character to most people, but you don't watch him do all those things that he did in the movie. You just watch him in one weekend where he gets up and he mows his lawn, he cleans his house a little bit, and then he sits on his deck and drinks some iced tea and watches the sunset. And then roll credits. And be going, wait, what the hell was that? That was completely boring. Yes, this is an interesting character, but that was probably the most boring thing I could have watched him do. So what you need a good plot. You need to have the character going through all of the events that they go through. And so the character is there for the plot to carry out, not the other way around. Now, he tells us that there are four traits that every character must have. Four traits that create a good character. So the first trait is that the character must be good. And this is another one of those points where we've strayed away from Aristotle's rule and yet have pretty much stayed the same, because he tells us the character must be good, but he defines that as the character must be of moral purpose. So the character must be of moral purpose. Now, what he originally meant was that at least your main character must actually be a good person. We must like the person, otherwise the audience won't be on board with that, with the character. Of course, we know now that that's not necessarily true. We now have this idea of the anti-hero. The main character is actually a villain, and we watch that character go through their story. But we're always given some type of moral purpose for the character. Quentin Tarantino does this a lot in all his movies. His main characters are always awful villains. Like, for instance, Kill Bill, the bride is this, violent, murderous assassin. But we're not just watching her go on a killing spree for no reason. We're given a moral purpose for why she's doing what she's doing. She was wronged by the people that she used to work with, and now she's going to get revenge on them. And this goes all the way back to probably either one of the first or the most prominent anti-hero created was Shakespeare's play Richard III. Richard III is Interestingly, it's the fourth play in a trilogy, the trilogy being Henry VI. And so we watch the revolt of Richard's family take the throne away from Henry VI. And then in this fourth play, we have Richard III come out, and he speaks directly to us, directly to the audience, and he tells us that I just helped my brother Edward win the throne, and I was promised a very prominent position in my brother's new government. And now that I've helped him take the throne, he's gone back on his promise, and I wasn't given what I was told I would be given. So, what you, the audience, what you're going to be doing for the rest of this play is I'm going to murder every single person in this play, and you're going to watch me do it. So let's go and have some fun watching that. And that's how the play starts. Now, Shakespeare doesn't give us Richard III and him just coming out and saying, I'm going to kill everybody in this play, so let's go. He gives you some type of moral purpose. I helped these people take the throne, and they went back on what they promised me, so I'm going to get revenge on them. We get some type of moral purpose for the character. So, in a way, we still held true to Aristotle's rule that the character must be good. And even for your antagonist character, even for the bad guy in the story, the character themselves must have some type of moral purpose, some reasoning to themselves as to why they're doing what they're doing. It's something that we'll talk about in the section that you're going to watch next about acting, where an actor can't judge their character. You have to find why the character thinks they're a good person. And it goes back to this rule from Aristotle that the character must be good, or at least the character must think they're good. The character must have some type of moral purpose. The second rule he gives us is that the character must be realistic. And so what he means by this is that the audience must believe that character would exist. So he's saying that the character you create, they can't be kind of like a caricature of sorts. If you're going to have a story that takes place in the Wild West, and your main character is this Wild West cowboy, and it's a realistic depiction of the Wild West. You can't have Yosemite Sam come out and shooting his guns off in the air, because the audience is going to look at that and say, well, that's not realistic. That's not how that person really existed at that time. So the character must be realistic. But along with that, in the third rule, he tells us the character must be appropriate. What he means is the audience must believe that character would exist in the world of the story. So you can have a realistic depiction of a character, but furthermore, even if the character is a realistic depiction, the audience needs to believe that that character would exist in the place that you put them. So again, take our Wild West cowboy. Say you did actually create a realistic depiction of that person, but you set them in present day New York City, and he's trotting down the street on his horse with his gun holstered, looking for, I don't know, looking for criminals to wrangle up or something. And your audience will say, that that person doesn't really exist there. So I don't believe it. So the character themselves needs to be a realistic depiction of that type, but furthermore, the character itself needs to be appropriate to the world of that story. Now, the fourth trait on his list that he gives us is kind of two-part, and so I'll give you both parts, and then I'll explain each of them individually. So the character must be consistent or consistently inconsistent. This is basically a way of saying whatever you create for the character at the beginning of the story, you must follow through with throughout the rest of the story. So the first part, the character must be consistent. So like it sounds, whatever it is that you create for the character at the beginning, you follow through with that throughout the rest of the story. The character themselves needs to be consistent. Now, of course, you can say, well, the character will change in the story, and that's absolutely true. The character will make some type of change by the end of the story. But in order for that change to be meaningful, the character needs to have been consistent throughout everything up to that point. Um, you know, an example of this is in those Back to the Future movies. Every time someone says to Marty McFly, "What are you, chicken?" then he's going to do whatever it is he knows he shouldn't do. And at the end of the story, someone calls him chicken, and he finally, you know, shows that he's matured and says, I'm not going to do whatever it is I know I shouldn't do just because you said that." But if halfway through the story someone calls him chicken and he looks at him and goes, you know, chicken, that's the most immature thing I've ever heard. I'm not, what does that mean? And then walks away. Well, that change he makes at the end of the story is no longer meaningful because the character wasn't consistent. But the second half of this, that the character needs to be consistently inconsistent, is basically saying the same thing. And what Aristotle is saying is that you can have an inconsistent character. But if that's what you're creating for the character, that they are inconsistent, then you need to be consistent with that throughout the rest of the story. And the character can find some consistency in the end, but in order for that to be meaningful, the character needs to have been inconsistent throughout the story preceding it. So the character must be consistent or consistently inconsistent. Now, there's one other thing that Aristotle gives us about character that's not part of this list of 4 traits, but is part of defining a character. And that is, the character must have a tragic flaw. Now, the tragic flaw is something you've probably heard throughout your life in your English classes. It's and talked a lot about. A tragic flaw is basically some aspect to the character's um, some aspect to the person's character that will ultimately lead to their downfall. It's something that a fault that the character has that will ultimately bring them down. Um, the go-to tragic flaw for Hollywood is usually alcoholism. He's a great person, but he's an alcoholic, and so eventually that'll unravel his whole life. You know, a good example of that was that Denzel Washington movie Flight. He's an amazing pilot and he saved lives, but he's also an alcoholic, and so ultimately that'll lead to his downfall. So the tragic flaw is something that a character must have. But what Aristotle tells us is that the purpose of the tragic flaw is that it creates one of 2 things in your audience. It creates fear or pity. And so he says it'll create pity because the audience feels the consequences the character is suffering greatly outweighs what they did to bring those consequences on. Or it'll create fear because the audience sees a lot of themselves in the main character and fear the same fate will fall on them. And so this is the purpose of those 2 things. This is how they will come about. And what he tells us about the tragic flaw is that the character's downfall can't come simply because they're a jerk. And so who doesn't like watching bad things happen to bad people? A character's downfall must come from some type of flaw in their character, some type of missing information. The downfall can't come simply because they had it coming. And one of the, I think, best examples of this is the character we see in our picture here of Oedipus. The story where when Oedipus was born, there was a prophecy told to his parents that he's going to grow up and he's going to murder his father and marry his mother. And so his parents get rid of him, and he's taken to the next town over and raised by the king and queen in that town. And when Oedipus becomes an adult, he's told the same prophecy: you're going to murder your father and marry your mother. And so he wants to avoid that. So he runs away from home and runs right back to the original town. And throughout the course of the story, He does, in fact, end up unknowingly murdering his father, unknowingly marrying his mother, having 4 children with her, one of them in this picture here, Antigone. Um, and then eventually everything comes to light. He realizes that in trying to run away from his fate, he's run right back into it. And so he blinds himself and leaves in exile. Now, the one thing that we learn throughout the story from Oedipus is that he's kind of a jerk. He's very cocky. He's very sure of himself. Um, he doesn't listen to anybody's advice. He thinks that he can defy the gods by running away from his fate. And so he, the character of Oedipus has a downfall, but the downfall doesn't come because he's just a cocky jerk. His downfall comes from just one simple piece of missing information, that the parents he grew up with are actually his adopted parents and not his biological parents. And that's what leads to his ultimate downfall. And the tragic flaw aids in that, because his tragic flaw is hubris. He's so sure of himself, so cocky, that he can't see reason or truth in front of him. So the tragic flaw aids the downfall. But ultimately, the character's downfall comes from not from, just because they deserve it, but from some piece of missing information. So that is how Aristotle defines character. So that brings us to number 3 on our list. So we have the first most important element of every story is the plot. Second most important element of every story are the characters. And the third most important element of every story is the theme. So number 3 is theme. So what is the theme of a story? Well, basically, the way Aristotle describes it is it's when something is proved to be true or not true. But a much easier way of understanding that is basically just the underlying meaning of the story. That is what a theme is, the underlying meaning of a story. So, for example, someone will ask you, okay, what is the story about? And you'll tell them the plot. Well, it's about a guy who creates a shoe company, and he's a cutthroat businessman and ends up creating the biggest shoe company the world has ever seen. And you say, okay, so that's what it's about. But then the person asks, okay, but what is it really about? And you say, oh, okay, well, it's about a guy who was abandoned by his parents, and he felt like he never belonged anywhere. And so he feels like he has so much to prove. And he wants to know to himself that he's worthwhile, because he's always felt this sense that he was never belonged anywhere. And so he ends up creating the world's biggest shoe company just so he can prove his own self-worth to himself. And so it's about, how you find your self-worth. That would be the underlying meaning to the story. What is a story about? Someone will give you the plot, but then when you say, okay, but what's it really about? They give you the theme. I think the biggest example of a theme would be in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. The Crucible was written in the 50s, and it's basically the story of the Salem witch trials, about a time in American history where people thought that witchcraft was spreading, and so they put people on trial for as being a witch, and they would ask you, the question, "Are you a witch?" And you had one of 2 options. You could either admit to being a witch, and then in that case, you were basically shunned from the community, from the town. And considering the time period, it was basically a slow death sentence. You couldn't survive on your own. You needed the help of your town. Or you could deny being a witch, and we kill you. And those were your 2 options. In fact, what they would do sometimes is, to test if you were a witch, they would tie rocks to your legs and throw you in the ocean, or in the river or wherever. And if you rose to the top, then we know you're a witch and we kill you. And if you sink to the bottom and drown, well, then we know you're not a witch. And of course, the, the ridiculousness of that being that, well, you're dead in both circumstances. So Arthur Miller wrote this play in the 50s. But what was going on at this time was a period in American history called McCarthyism. People were afraid that communism was spreading throughout the United States. And so they created what was called the House of Un-American Activities. And if you were accused of being a communist, you would go in front of this committee and they would ask you a very famous question: are you now or have you ever been a communist? And you had one of two options. You could either admit to being a communist, at which point you would have to name the names of other communists that you knew, or you could deny being a communist and you were put on what was called the blacklist, which was an unwritten, unofficial list. And if you were on it, your life basically ceased. All functions of your life basically ceased then. You would be let go from your job. You wouldn't be able to find any other work. You wouldn't be able to find a place to live. No one will rent to you. No one will sell to you. Your children wouldn't be allowed at school. It's basically your whole life kind of ceased in that moment. And uh, and the only other alternative was to name other names. And what ended up happening was people would just name people they knew, knowing full well they weren't communist, and you're basically just putting another person through an entire ordeal that they don't deserve. Kind of like in Salem witch trials. If you admitted to being a witch, you had to name other people you knew as witches, even though you knew full well that they weren't. So in the 50s, everyone went to this play, The Crucible. People say, what is it about? Well, it's about the Salem witch trials. But then you ask, okay, but what is it really about? And everyone knew at that time what it really was about. It was about what was going on currently, of the whole system of McCarthyism. And this idea that, well, McCarthyism is basically just a witch hunt. And that was the theme of the play. So that was the underlying meaning to the story. And so that's basically what we mean by theme, that you have what is the underlying purpose, the underlying meaning to the story. Sometimes people will refer to a theme as the moral of the story or the message of the story. And so that's number 3, theme. So we have plot, we have character, we have theme, and that brings us to number 4, the fourth most important element of every story. And if you want to take a guess at it and you're guessing setting, well, not quite yet, though it's on the list, not here. Number 4 is diction. So what is diction? Well, very simply, diction is the dialogue, the words that are spoken. So diction refers to the individual way that the characters speak. How do the characters speak? How do the characters arrange their words? Um, the dialogue is the thing that drives the story in theater. You hear the story mainly through the dialogue, more so than the visuals. So Aristotle tells us that your diction must be true to that character. So, for instance, this refers to, or this embodies things like slang. What type of slang words do your characters use? What type of, I guess you call, speech patterns that the characters have. For instance, have you ever known somebody who says the word like after every other word in their sentence? Somebody who will approach you and say, it's like when I went to the store, like the store was like not open, like it was so like frustrating, and you're sitting there saying, oh my God, if you say the word like one more time, I'm going to go nuts. But that is that person's diction. If you were to write that person's dialogue, you would include all of those instances of the word like. Just like I'm sure we all have that one friend that curses way too much, where they use the F word in every other word, and it's really annoying. But that is their diction, that is their speech pattern. That's the way that they organize their words. And sometimes this could be regional slang terms, like in New England, around Boston area, people will use the word wicked quite often. And that would be proper diction for a character from that place. So diction is referring to the individual character's dialogue, the way each character individually speaks. You need to be true to the type of character's actual speech patterns. Um, one example of this is that again, I'm a playwright, and this will always happen to me where I'll write a play or I'll finish a draft and I'll give it to a friend of mine to read and ask for some feedback. And at least one person will always give me this one note where they'll point to a line of dialogue, and the line might say something like, "Me and Mark went to the store." And they'll point to it and say, "That's supposed to be Mark and I went to the store." And of course, you'll, be really annoyed and give them that little pretentious nod, or they'll give you the pretentious nod. And what they're missing is that, yes, that is proper grammar. Proper grammar dictates the sentence should be, Mark and I went to the store. The question is, how many people actually speak that way? Some people do. It's not to say nobody speaks that way, but it's noticeable. If you hear someone in just casual language say, Mark and I went to the store, it's a noticeable thing. And it says something about that character and the reason why they speak that way. Now, if you write that line of dialogue and you don't intend that to be an aspect of the character, then it's actually an improper line of dialogue. It's proper grammar, but improper diction. And so the proper diction or the proper line of dialogue would say, me and Mark went to the store. So diction refers to the character's individual word choices. And then closely related to that is number five. Number five being melody, the melody of a story. So let's take a look at melody and how Aristotle defines that. And basically, what he's referring to here is that the melody refers to how the dialogue sounds as a whole when spoken aloud. So diction refers to the individual character's word choice. Melody refers to the dialogue as a whole. How does it sound as a whole? And what he says here is that because theater or drama is driven by the dialogue, and it's an auditory thing, your dialogue should have some type of melodic quality to it. There should be a beat or some type of rhythm to the dialogue. A good example of this is the playwright August Wilson. August Wilson was a great American playwright, and I guess most notably right now, he was the playwright who wrote the play Fences, which was a movie recently with Denzel Washington and Viola Davis. But he was also he was more famous for the complete works that he did. He wrote something called the Century Cycle. It was 10 plays that each took place in a different decade in the 20th century. And each play dealt with the state of African Americans in America at that time. So the first play took place in 1904, second play it was in 1910s, third play 1920s, all the way up to the 10th play that took place in 1996. And so August Wilson finished this epic work right at the end of his life. But he was also known for the melody of his dialogue. They say that when you read his dialogue out loud, if you read his plays out loud, you'll hear jazz rhythms in the dialogue. The beat that the characters speak resembles jazz rhythms, and people would ask him about that. And they would say, they would ask him, do you do that intentionally? And he said, no, not intentionally, but it's just how I hear my characters speak. He would say, I'm a fan of jazz. I listen to jazz as I write, and so it permeates into the dialogue itself. And so he created this this pleasing melodic quality to his dialogue. And another playwright that's famous for their melody is David Mamet. David Mamet is a very different playwright from August Wilson, and he's known for mainly being the what people call the Shakespeare of the F word. His characters curse a lot, and his plays are usually about some type of anti-hero, some type of criminal, and it's a lot of times his plays, will deal with things like, honor among thieves and stuff like that. Um, but what's interesting about him, the reason why it works is because he created this kind of duality between his diction and his melody. So his diction, the word choice for the characters was very rough, very coarse. They cursed a lot. It was, a very rough dialogue. But his melody, he was able to craft the this dialogue in a way where if you read it out loud, it has a very poetic rhythm to it. It's almost like listening to a waltz. And so his plays are interesting because you have these two conflicting ideas of a coarse or rough diction along with a very soft, very poetic melody. So Aristotle here is talking about the rhythmic quality to the dialogue. If you ever study, Shakespearean acting, you'll find that there's a specific rhythm or beat to that dialogue, iambic pentameter. And so you'll learn that there's a certain rhythm that you're supposed to speak the lines in. And so this goes back again to Aristotle's idea that there must be some type of melodic quality to your dialogue. So that brings us to the last one, number 6. And number 6 is interesting because it's not exactly setting, it's something that we call spectacle, the spectacle of a play. And so the spectacle refers to all the visual elements of a production. You can see here an image of a show that's very dependent on the spectacle of The Lion King on Broadway. So this refers to all the visual elements of the show. So things like sets, lights, costumes, props, sound. Um, so Aristotle is saying that in the end, drama is still a visual art form. Again, the story is written for the purpose of being performed. So you can't ignore the visual element to it. But what he's saying, though, is that if you look at the list here of his 6 elements, he's saying that spectacle is very purposefully last on the list. That you can have a great spectacle, but it doesn't make up for an uninteresting plot, uninteresting characters, an uninsightful theme, poor diction, and uninteresting melody. It won't make up for all of that. That idea that, well, the play was bad, but the costumes were beautiful. That doesn't in the end make it a good show. However, you can have a great plot, great characters, great theme, diction, and melody, but if you ignore the visual aspect of the show, you're missing an important element of theater, of drama. So it's purposefully on the list, but it's very purposefully last on the list. The story and the characters and all that stuff are still more important than the spectacle, but spectacle is still on the list, and so you should still be mindful of the visual elements of the show. So Aristotle's 6 elements of drama in the Poetics, in order of importance, are plot, character, theme, diction, melody, and spectacle.